Our last speaker of the day is a 15-year veteran of the games industry. He has worked as a QA tester in Sony's research and development department and on the BioShock series at 2K Marin. He was co-founder of the Fulbright company and founded Dim Games. Please welcome Johnnemann Nordhagen to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to this, and thanks also to Konsoll for having me. So let me figure out how this works. Here we go. Oh. 1 second. Technical difficulties. This is the fun part of the talks, definitely. I'm a professional programmer. I just want everybody to know that, and so technology is my friend. I got it. I'm not going to use this clicker, though, because it seems to screw things up. So, all right, so about me first. I already had a little bit of an intro. But I worked at Sony Research and Development during the launch of the PlayStation 3, and then I helped 2K Games port BioShock to that platform. Then I worked on BioShock 2 as a gameplay, UI, AI platform, all kinds of programmers. And then helped with the DLC for that game, and then moved on to work on this game called The Bureau XCOM Declassified. And then, maybe because of that game, maybe not, I quit AAA development and went indie, founded the Fulbright company with some coworkers of mine, moved up to Portland. We made a game called Gone Home. I also should mention, because of Raf's talk, before I did any of this professional stuff, I was actually a MUD developer on a game called Discworld MUD that probably no one has played. So after Gone Home, though, I went back to San Francisco and I founded my own company called Dim Games. If you can spot the pun there, maybe. And then after 4 years of work there, we shipped earlier this year in February the game Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. And Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, if you are not familiar with it, it's a single-player narrative game about traveling and telling stories. It's set in an America inspired by folklore and the Great Depression. It's different from other narrative games, though, because instead of having one sort of single central story, instead, we have these 16 different characters that you meet along the way, and each of these characters was written by a different writer. So the game is sort of like this collection of short stories in video game form. The stories, though, they share a theme, the kind of failure of the American dream, especially as it relates to those outside the mainstream of American society. What happens in the game is the player is cursed to wander the land as the personification of folklore, kind of picking up stories and spreading them around so that they grow. And also collecting the life stories of these 16 different characters that you meet. It's inspired by countless sources, most prominently things like The Grapes of Wrath, On the Road, Huckleberry Finn, Easy Rider, Matawan, Carnival, Sister of the Road, the poems of Allen Ginsberg and Langston Hughes, and the world described in American folklore, full of grifters and loners and ghosts and magic and tragedy. Each character is also heavily researched and drawn from historical contexts such as the miners' strikes, the Pullman Porters, the Bonus Army, the Long Walk of the Navajo, and many others. The game has a 3D overworld of the player wanders, having various adventures, and 2D conversation scenes between the player and the characters. In small branching choice sequences scattered around the world, the player collects stories on a variety of topics, and then trades those over the campfire with the characters encountered to learn more about their lives and their personal stories. Over time, these stories that the player scatters around will be passed from person to person and grow in the telling, becoming better stories, although less true. Through all this, the player must maintain their health and other resources against the difficulties of the hobo life. If they can do this and earn the trust and see the true inner selves of all 16 characters, their assigned task is over and they can rest. I've given a bunch of talks about this game in the past, but they mostly have focused on different little aspects of it. So I've talked about the historical research that went into it. I've talked about the writing process and using all these different writers. I've talked about the game as a political and moral statement. I've talked about the process of creating our characters. But today, what I'm going to try and do, and I hope this is helpful, is kind of lay out the entire development process from beginning to end. This isn't meant to be telling you how to do anything for various reasons that will become clear in the talk, but this is just sort of radical honesty, maybe, about exactly what this process was like, and hopefully getting to see the inside of the process of making a game will give you some sort of knowledge at the other end. We'll see. So for the beginning of this intensely American game, we begin very far away from the US. After Gone Home shipped, I went backpacking all over the place. I went to a bunch of places. I went to Europe, Morocco, Turkey, Nepal, India, Japan, Russia. And I mostly did this by like train or bus or boat and sometimes by camel. But really never by plane, or only occasionally by plane. And that's not because I hate airplanes or anything like that, but it's because taking an airplane is a little bit like teleporting, right? You go to this like weird building that's sort of the same no matter where it's located, and you seal yourself into a little tube, and maybe you go to sleep, and some number of hours later you wake up and you're in a different spot. You have no idea whether you got there over deserts or oceans or glaciers or any other way. It's kind of very much about the destination and not about the journey. Whereas when you're on a train or a bus or walking around or something like that, hopefully you get to have adventures, right? At the very least, you get to see the kind of stuff you're passing over, and it's very, very different to take a train over a desert landscape or through a mountain range or through Siberia or something like that, right? And also, when you're doing this kind of traveling, you get to meet people. You meet your fellow travelers most often, you know, also locals, but some of the people you meet will be your fellow travelers. And it turns out, when you travel for a long time, you tend to see some of the same people again and again, like cropping up in different places, and you can kind of meet them and share stories with them and swap exactly what you did and what they did, and tell them like, oh yeah, well you should absolutely go here, or watch out, I got my pocket picked here, or you know, all these cool things, right? Also, I do want to thank Konsoll for gathering together this captive audience for me to show off my vacation photos. But at the near the end of my travels, I was on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and there's I didn't take many pictures of this, but you can see my good buddy Vladimir there, and also Vladimir's tomb over there. But the thing about Siberia, right, is that it's very big, and it's really boring. I mean, it's kind of exciting, right? It's Siberia. It's got this mystery to it, but actually, it's really boring. Sorry. And to get across Siberia by train, it takes a week. You are sitting on a train, literally, it's moving all the time for a week. And so I got bored. And I started thinking about video games, as one does. And specifically, I was thinking about what kind of game I might want to make next, like where I go from here, right? And these are kind of the first big decisions of where the water tastes like wine, the process of making it. I knew that I wanted to make a game that only I could make, right? I thought that this might be my only chance to make a game, and that if I was going to do one, I wanted to make it mine. My whole prior career being a programmer, I had mostly worked for other people on other people's ideas, and I was like, nope, this one's going to be me. I didn't want it to be combat focused. That's for a few reasons. Some of them are practical. It actually is a little bit more expensive to put in like NPCs. You have to do all this logic for AI and weapons and combat. Also, I don't know a lot about that stuff. I know a little bit because I was a gameplay programmer, so I know a tiny bit about design, but really that's not something I wanted to focus on. And then there's a little bit of a philosophical reason, is that I think there's enough kind of shooting and killing and that sort of stuff in games, and I wanted to maybe try and see what other verbs are available to us as creators and players. And then lastly, I wanted to experiment with this game. I wanted to try and push the boundaries of what games could be. I think the exciting thing about going indie is that you get freed from some of the constraints that exist for AAA studios, and you get to see what kind of wild and wacky things you can come up with. So I had to answer some of those questions posed by that, right? Like, what kind of game could only I make? What are the set of things that are important to me and that I want to talk about in a video game? Travel was at the top of the list for maybe, hopefully, obvious reasons. Music was next. I'm a big fan of music, specifically American roots music, which is things like blues and bluegrass, jazz, folk music, stuff like that. I also really like folklore, and the sort of thing that's referenced in this folk music, and folklorish things, right? Things like lonely gamblers and desperate outlaws, wanderers, murderers, overworked miners, and train drivers, and things like that. And I think there's another interesting thing about folklore, too. I really like this idea of an open culture. So these days, we go and we see a movie that's been written by someone, and it's got a single set story, and we all see the same movie, and we know that, right? And it's someone else's movie. But it used to be that you'd kind of sit around and tell stories, and you'd hear a story, and maybe you'd go on to tell that to someone else, and you'd add your own little spin to it, right? You'd change names, you'd add more adventures, you'd remove things that you didn't think would work, and these stories kind of just wander all over the place, being kind of the same story and kind of a little different. And the same thing happens with music too, of course, right? You perform a song and keep what works and toss out what doesn't. I'm also very interested in politics and history, both like current political stuff and also how we got to where we are today, all the things that have happened. And I wanted to make a game that was book-like. In my most pretentious times, I call it a literary game. But I feel like games derive a lot of inspiration from other games and from movies, but there aren't a lot of games that try and be like a book, right? So, to me, travel plus bluegrass plus history suggests basically one period of time, which is the Great Depression. If you're not familiar with what that is, that's a time in American history when everything went really badly. The economy crashed. There was also a giant man-made natural disaster, and there were 2 million people wandering the United States as hobos. No one had enough to eat. It was a really bad time. But it does bring to mind this sort of romantic notion of hobos, riding the rails on trains, and this idea of extreme freedom, right? You don't have a job, you don't have any responsibilities, so you just get to wander where you will over the country. And that has a certain romantic pull to it, right? And that's also kind of the heyday of this kind of music in a lot of ways. So that springs naturally to mind as well. And then also that period of time, I feel like, has a lot to say about where we are currently. I think there are a ton of parallels between then and now, especially in the United States, in some really maybe frightening ways. All over the world, really. So all of that tied nicely together to meet my goals. So that's where I went, the Great Depression. However, I still had to think about what kind of game this was. So I started thinking about the genres of games that I personally like to play that have a lot of exploratory travel in them, since that's what the main focus of this game is going to be, traveling around, right? And the very first thing I thought of was Jrpgs, because there's some cool things about them. Often, this is especially like the Final Fantasy 7 through 10 era-ish, They often have like a big world map that you get to wander around and explore at your own pace and find neat things in. They have this really cool enemy design where you have these little encounters and you get to interact with these neat creatures, and you have a variety of ways to defeat them, right? And then they also have big weird bosses or cool summons or whatever that have these really neat, exciting, visually interesting character designs. So how do you take a JRPG and remove the combat was the next thing I was thinking about. And I think that once I would start thinking about stories and narrative games and things like that, what I came up with was that these little battles can transform maybe into small narrative encounters. And the big bosses might turn into longer, more interesting conversations, somehow using those little adventures to fuel, to build up to those, right? And then we get to keep the cool enemy and world design of JRPGs by incorporating this cool American folklore stuff, this kind of fantastical, weird things that are happening in these songs and stories. So there we go. It's a game about traveling this overworld, having these little random narrative encounters, and using those to contribute to bigger boss fights set in the Great Depression. That's what the game is. However, I also wanted to kind of try and articulate what the values of the game is. Because, again, I said, I had these political and moral things that I was trying to reach for. And I knew immediately that if I was going to set a game in this period of history, I didn't want to overly romanticize it, and I didn't want to whitewash it, right? Again, there's this thing of these happy hobos traveling around the country, singing songs and having a great old time, and obviously that is not what it was actually like, right? So my first value was don't make it all white men having a rollicking old time riding the rails. And then it had also become clear to me through the development of Gone Home and also various things that were happening in the indie scene and video games in general at this time that accurate representation is a really important thing for games to be worried about. And so I wanted to make sure that all the people that were shown in the game were portrayed accurately and with humanity. And then I think there's no reason in making art, especially personal art, especially something risky and experimental, if you don't have something to say, if you don't have something to stand up for, right? And so I think that it was important for the game to have strong themes that I believed in and try to back them up as much as we could. So what other stories are there that happen in the Great Depression besides this sort of very cleaned up version of hobo life? Well, if you know anything at all about American history, then you'll know that black people contribute a huge amount to it. So I read this book. Actually, this was still while I was on the train in Siberia. I read this. There's a lot of time to read, too, it turns out. I read this book called All God's Dangers. That's a biography of a sharecropper in the South. This is post-slavery, but still in the Jim Crow era. And he joins a union to protect his rights as a sharecropper. And I thought about, okay, well, if I wanted to put this character into my game, how do I write that character? And I thought about okay, well, I'm a privileged white dude. I don't think I can do that. I don't think there's any way I can write this sharecropper in this era. That's, you can do a lot doing research and doing interviews with people and things like that. Gone Home, for example, the writer of that, Steve, was not a teenage girl. He wrote it anyway. We did a lot of interviews with people who were growing up gay as young women in the 90s before we wrote that game. But the problem is that you can't actually go interview any sharecroppers, right? I had picked a period of history that it's very difficult to interview people from. So the solution that I came up with was, okay, well, I'll just get someone else to write that character, right? That's easy. I can find someone who is can bring a more authentic voice to that. But then that immediately presented a new problem. So am I the right person to write any of the characters that I want to put in this game, right? Like American history is hugely diverse. I knew I wanted to have, Hispanic folks and indigenous folks, right? Queer folks, all sorts of the variety of people that make up American history. So I came up with a new solution. Why don't I get someone to write each individual character here? And I really liked that idea because not only did it solve the problem of representation in the game, but it also supported the values in another way by increasing the diversity of the team, right? Making more diverse people able to help create this game. And I don't think that this is something that has been done before, making this kind of game as an anthology of short stories by individual authors. There's definitely, there's been anthology games before, no doubt, and tons of games have writers' rooms with large teams of diverse writers. But to my knowledge, no one has ever made a game where the narrative focus is on a bunch of individual writers' work considered separately. So I thought that was a really neat thing. This is going to be a common theme, hopefully, through this talk, is this was sort of this decision that was a creative solution to many problems that arose. I kind of painted myself into a corner and thought of a way out of it, or maybe was forced into a way out of it. And it turns out that I'm really good at painting myself into corners, so that works out well. I want to talk a little bit about the themes of the game. I said that those were an important part of building a game to me. And so what did I want this game to be about? First of all, I wanted it to be about America, interrogating the American dream and the kind of image and values of that country. I wanted it to be about seeking and not finding, this unfulfilled potential, sort of tying into the first theme, this idea that the United States thinks of itself in a very particular way, but we've never really achieved any of the ideals that we hold so dear. It's about traveling, of course. It's about telling stories. Another theme is folklore and the way stories change and grow. And actually, that's where the title of the game came from. There's this folk song with that in it as a line, and actually that line kind of crops up in a number of folk stories and sayings and things like that, this idea of where the water tastes like wine. And not only does it hearken to this idea of stories growing and changing over time, the way that these songs and stories do, but it also kind of refers to a place where everything is wonderful, right? And sometimes in the stories, this place is somewhere far away, unknown. Sometimes it's the next county over. But always there's this idea that there's a place where if only you could get there, the water tastes like wine, living is easy, everything is wonderful. And that really points back to this idea of searching for something that you're unfortunately never going to find. I wanted it to be about the stories that don't usually get told, right? We have a lot of myths and folklore in the United States, a lot of history, and there are also a bunch of things that happened that we don't normally hear about, or a lot of stories that kind of get swept under the rug, and I wanted to kind of try and bring those to light. And then a theme that emerged, that I didn't set out with, but that emerged through the creation of the game is one of labor history and workers' rights. That seemed to be a very common thread among the ignored stories that I dug up. When I got back home from doing all this traveling, I immediately set to work, and I made another decision that I regret, which was bringing on an artist immediately. And I don't regret the artist at all. His name's Kellen Jett. He did all this and many of the other pieces that you'll see through this talk, and obviously it's gorgeous. It defines the style of the game. It really stands out from everything else that's out there. But this was way, way too early to have another person on the project. I didn't really know what I was making yet. I had all these ideas, but nothing firm enough. The kind of common wisdom at this time in indie games was that you could not be too early in promoting your game. You kind of had to start immediately and just keep talking about it for the entire development cycle, or else no one would ever hear about it. And so part of the reason that I wanted an artist was that I wanted to be able to start marketing. You know, I wanted to push these images out to the world and say, look, I'm making something exciting, right? And also, I knew that one of the big challenges of this game was going to be creating assets, and I wanted to get started on that as soon as possible. So when I give people advice about making games, one of the first things that I tell them is that it's a really, really good idea to make prototypes of games before you make them, right? There's a few reasons for this. One, you can decide whether this game is possible to make at all, right? Maybe you'll run into some technical problem that you can't solve, or your design that you thought was great isn't actually going to work out, or you know, there's a variety of reasons your pipeline doesn't work, whatever that is. You can figure out how you make a game, right? You can try and get the idea of what the pipeline of putting stuff in starts to look like. You can also test for fun or whatever other emotion you want to create with this game. You can put prototypes in front of people and see if they respond the way you want. And then you can also test for compellingness, like you can see whether people are drawn to stay with your game and to play it and actually finish it. So that's all really good advice, and I almost totally ignored it, even though it was my advice. I didn't do enough prototypes of the game to start with, and I have some good excuses for that. I'm going to tell them to you. The game was a big experiment, right? But I knew that I wanted to make it regardless. I knew that this might be my only chance to make the game that I wanted to make. Gone Home was pretty successful, and it provided both the money and the kind of attention of the world that I thought might make a commercial indie project seem viable. So that's why I didn't test. That's part of the reason I didn't test whether this game should be the one I was going to be making. I wanted to make it no matter what. And then also, it's really hard to prototype a narrative game. I got some mechanics going on pretty early, right? And I made some prototypes of like various storytelling games. The best one that came out of that was this kind of Mad Lib style thing where there would be this word cloud floating, and it would put out some bits of a sentence, and then you have to choose like a noun or a verb to fill in that slot from the things floating. And if you waited too long, it would start inserting like filler words. But aside from counting the filler words in that or whatever, how do you even score whether that's a good story or not, right? We just haven't invented the tech that can tell you whether a story is good, unfortunately. And also, if you've ever done a Mad Lib style thing, you'll know that the stories you get out of that are really just goofy, like they're silly, right? And they didn't match the tone of the game at all. The game was trying to be serious and somber and like capital M meaningful, right? And you got these goofy little stories. It was really bringing it down. So in the end, the only way to see if a narrative game is compelling, especially a game that leans as strongly on writing as this one does, was to see it with writing, right? You need to have, if you just want people to read really good stories, you need to have really good stories for them to read. You need to have some great writing for people to encounter. And without that, the game was always going to feel flat and unsatisfying. So I just dove right in. I hired Gita Jackson to write this character, the sharecropper, that I'd started researching. I gave her all the notes that I had and what I had, taken a stab at writing as far as what the structure might be like. And we started to try and test out what telling a story in this way might look like. So our first pass, conversations happened through a tarot deck. The player would play cards from their deck, and that would be like interpreted kind of broadly as a question or a prompt for the character to respond with their own recollections or their own feelings about whatever you just showed them. And then at the end of the conversation, the character would say, "I've told you all this, how about you give me a story in return?" And the player would tell a story back. And what we learned from that is that the character content there, what Gita had written, it was excellent. It was really good. It was wonderful to read. But this system around it, it felt bad. It felt really gamey. It felt very arbitrary. And it was weird to just like sit through all this stuff and then have a story at the end that was also this monolithic thing that wasn't very interesting. However, that lasted a little while because I didn't know what to do about all those problems, and making a game means doing about 20 different things at once. So while we were testing this out, production was also going on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about all the disciplines of that and what state they were all in through this time, through the kind of middle of the development of the game. We had 2D art, for example. This included the characters plus their transformations. We had this kind of weirdness system in the game early on as well, that as time went on, everything in the game would get weirder and weirder. That included the 3D art and the 2D art and the vignettes and everything else. And so at the kind of apex of that, all the characters would transform into this interesting form, right? And we also needed to make like the tarot cards. We needed to make the little vignette adventures that you were experiencing. And we were trying to do day-night scenes as well during this time. We wanted to have a time of day system. And you can see, actually, this is art that didn't make it into the game, but this is a daytime scene here with one of our characters. And it turns out that 2D art has a lot of advantages, but lighting is not one of them. And when you want to do different lighting, you have to basically redraw the entire illustration. And so this whole process of making 2D art turned out to be very, very slow. These illustrations are gorgeous, but it turns out that that amount of pretty takes time. We were also working on UI art at this time. That's another kind of 2D art, but a little bit more functional. Unfortunately, we had the same person doing the UI to have a consistent look, and not only was he not really a UI artist with that kind of expertise, but also he was trying to do all the rest of the things that I just mentioned. This is an early version of a city menu screen that we had, and again, you can see it's beautiful. It's also incredibly detailed, and you can imagine doing how long it would take to do 22 of these. We were also doing 3D art. Luckily, this was a different artist, but we were trying to create a look that matched the 2D art, which was really hard to do, it turned out. Like turning that 2D thing into a 3D is difficult, especially because neither myself nor my artist were really very good at art direction, it turned out. He was a brilliant artist, but communicating that was very hard. I am someone who just says, pretty please, and see what I get back. It was really difficult to communicate what we wanted. This is a shot from this period of development. It's not at all what the game looks like now, but that's what the 3D art looked like at the time. But eventually, we did get another 3D artist, someone who was able to work in the office with us to make the communication a little easier, had previous connections with the 2D artist, so already knew how to work with him, and also was just very good at self-direction. And she was able to really capture the look that we needed, and I think you can see a little bit of the difference there. It's still the same style, but hopefully looks much better. However, we had 5 different regions of the US that we were trying to make, and each of those had their own 3D art style, or they had the same style, but they had different looks to them, right? They had different color palettes and different things that were needed, stuff like that. That makes 5 times more work, in case you didn't know that. During this time, we were continuing writing, and this was going on really, really well. I kept hiring new writers to do new characters, and really the only challenge here was kind of reaching outside my Rolodex, the people that I already knew and was familiar with, to find people who would be really good fits for representing all of these different characters. So you can see some of our writers up here. This is from one of our final posters. Some good names up there like Emily Short and Austin Walker, Lee Alexander, Kara Ellison, all sorts of talented folks, various stripes. There's also, I have talked about these a little bit, mentioned them, the vignettes in the game. They're these little adventures, they're not the big character conversations, but they're little tiny branching text adventures that you have as you're wandering around. And we were trying also at this time to figure out how those work. We needed to create art for them, but also we didn't know what they were exactly. So initially they were just totally random adventures. They had very little direction to them. We added mechanical effects to them to kind of give them something that felt like purpose. You know, you could get food out of them, or money, or tiredness. You know, various things could happen to you. And at one point they were even tied to loose themes based around this idea of hobo code, which is like hobos would scratch symbols on the doorways or posts to tell each other, like, this house has a mean dog, or this person is really generous and will help you out if you say the right things, you know, stuff like that. It was really cool, but it didn't really work, unfortunately. And what we were doing here was occasionally you'd get like kind of random drops of new cards for the tarot card storytelling game. I don't know why. Luckily, I had two really excellent writers for these vignettes to begin with. Laura Mache and Duncan Fife were helping me with those. Then there's also like level design, which I initially minimized a bunch because I was like, well, you know, we're just making the US, whatever. It's not that hard. And initially, the 3D artist was doing the layout of this as well. You can see another early shot here laid over one of our period maps that we were using to plan this all out. It turns out, though, that there's a little bit more to level design than just putting things where they go, and that we needed to figure out how to direct the player to the right places, how to place stories and adventures correctly, all that stuff. There's also, like, coming back to the design of the game as a whole, right? It was a total mess. There was this mechanical layer that was sort of bolted on. There were these conversations that still weren't working correctly. Vignettes were boring, like the writing in them was good, but there was like, what's the purpose? The storytelling didn't feel good, which is what this game was about. And we weren't fulfilling what the game was about, right? Like, the storytelling was super minimal, the traveling wasn't any fun, the vignette adventures were pointless. Like, what are we doing here? Now I get to talk about one of the couple parts that were working well, which was the code. Luckily, since I'm a programmer, and this is a very simple game technically, all this stuff is just kind of going along. I could make all these systems all day. None of it felt particularly challenging. We didn't have any issues there, luckily. I guess that shows something. Another part that was going really well was the music. There wasn't a whole lot of it yet, but it really sounded amazing. I'm going to try and play a little bit of this, not for long here. This is by Ryan Ike, the composer. Going down to the river, gonna cleanse my soul. All right, so I was really happy with that. It's great. He used all like live musicians, some really great performers to make this. The soundtrack is spectacular. It spans basically the entire range of American music, various kinds. But anyway, besides the music and the code, stuff really needed to change. So at this point, we did a huge redesign of the whole game. Luckily, once again, I had painted myself into this horrible corner, and there seemed to be only one way out of it. I tore out the tarot card conversation system, which wasn't working. And now, instead, we got back to our goal of making this a game about storytelling, and now the player trades stories with the characters. So instead of just playing a card, you tell a story that has a subject, and that subject prompts the character to respond with their own kind of musings along the same lines. And that made the goal of these vignettes very clear. They provide you stories. That's really neat. It feels like you're going through this adventure, and at the end of it, you get to tell someone about it. And that also meant that traveling now felt a lot better because you were excited to find these vignettes, to see what cool stories you could get out of them. This also made writing the vignettes much easier because it wasn't about like shoehorning in some weird mechanical thing. It was just about making a cool story that would come out later, right? And so we made kind of stories the currency of this game, which was another interesting thing. The mechanics still existed, but we kind of highly de-emphasized them. We had some special non-story vignettes that were very short. They're not meant to be entertaining, but they did provide you resources. But we simplified that system a whole lot and tied it into cities, the cities that you visited. So those became resource hubs where you got and traded resources, basically. There were also fast travel warp spots, save points, and each city provides you with a unique story that's tied to that place, folklore from Detroit or from Denver or whatever. However, this led to some new problems, luckily not nearly as bad. Most of the writing had been completed against this old system, right? Because we were trying to be in production this whole time, even when the design wasn't working. And so we needed to edit and rewrite it for the new system. Plus, some of the writing just needed even more work, right? Like, these were professional writers, but I'd given them a lot of freedom, and sometimes the writing needed to go in a slightly different direction or whatever. And it turns out that I don't really know how to edit. This was a job that I had taken on. I'd been like, oh yeah, editing stuff. I don't know, you remove typos, you move commas around, so that works. But no. And also, we needed a ton of vignettes to make the United States interesting. I don't know, the United States is also very big, and it takes a lot of stories to fill it. So what I did was I hired Laura to edit and rewrite all the character and vignette stuff, and then hired a whole team of vignette writers to write the rest of these stories. And they're another incredibly talented group of people, some wonderful folks up there. This is another of our posters. Then disaster struck, a couple disasters actually, all at once. I had an art disaster. Both of my artists were gone within the space of a few weeks for various reasons. So there I was with no art team. About half the characters were done. There was very little UI. We were lacking many of the unique assets that we needed, like city illustrations and things like that. We were missing most of our vignette art. We only had one region's 3D assets made. And also, at the same time, I was sort of facing a financial disaster. I had been self-funding this game from the beginning, and at this point, I was starting to maybe run out of money a little bit. And there was no deadline in sight for the game because, no art was being made. So it was like, the money's going, and I see no endpoint here. And I can't really afford to hire new artists to replace these because I don't have any money. And this is when Serenity Forge came to the rescue, my co-developer. So I partnered with them to complete the rest of the art as kind of a co-development effort. And they were great. They were really good at matching the existing art style, and it was a full art team, which is really what we had needed from the beginning, not two artists, both of them overworked. So that went really well. And then, as far as the level design went, I sort of formalized that process more. I took that on, which, I'm also not a level designer, but I did it. It was a lot of work. You can see here, this is my graph paper map of the United States. Each of those squares is one sector that gets loaded in at a time, and each of them is made of many tiles. And I put an X through each one as I finished it. They're color-coded by region. That was a page in my notebook that stayed open for a long time. And in order to help me with this, I used a lot of Google Earth to see what the terrain at various places was like. I actually worked with a friend of mine, brought him on, hired him for a little while, and then he sort of taught me what was going on. JP Le Breton, who worked with me at 2K Marin, he's a real level designer, and he sort of gave me an overview of how I could maybe make this work. And we used some period maps to figure out where roads should be at that time in the US, things like that. That's kind of cool. Here's another little video. This is, I don't know what that says.
Gain access. You need a...
No! Okay, we're not going to watch that video. That's the way that works. Sorry. It's a really cool video. You don't get to see it. It's just the process of me actually transforming this stuff, laying out all the individual tiles so you can see where that is. But I'll try and post that to YouTube or something later. So I want to talk here a little bit about scope. When I originally set out to make this game, it was supposed to be simple and short and take about 2 years to develop, and that was really just not happening at this point. The game was turning out to be giant, epic, which was just, whoops, like I fucked up. But we did consider scoping down, especially when we were running out of money. We came up with a number of ideas for doing that. We thought about maybe just releasing some set of characters and releasing the other ones as DLC or doing that later. We thought about doing the same thing with regions of the country, where we would release just one region of the country and then maybe release other ones later. We thought about just not doing the 3D portion of the game and somehow working a different interface for discovering all these stories and stuff. We didn't end up doing any of those, but they were on the table, and many people might say that we should have done one of them. I don't know. I'm actually really happy with the way the game turned out in the end product, so I'm glad we pushed through. So here we are on the home stretch of this video game, hopefully. We were going to shows at this point in time and doing really well at them. We went to Day of the Devs, we went to the Mix, both at GDC and E3, Indiecade at E3, South by Southwest, Amaze. We were getting like best of shows and winning awards, and that was really cool. Also, we were getting really good press. We were getting these glowing previews from places like The Guardian, Le Monde, Game Informer, Rock Paper Shotgun, Paste, Unwinnable, Ars Technica, more of them. And so it seemed like kind of the right time to be maybe looking for some help. We went looking for publishers. And this had kind of started way back, like in fact, the minute that I announced that I was starting a new studio, publishers started calling me, which I'm really sad that I didn't take that more seriously at the time. I turned them all down. But we were kind of looking for support a little bit through the entire development of the game. But either we weren't getting offers from publishers or we didn't like the offers we were getting. What we were looking for at this point was just kind of finishing funds, like we needed to test the game. It was a big game and we needed to pay for QA somehow. We wanted marketing support. At this point when we started the game, right after Gone Home, it seemed like maybe you could just release a cool new innovative game and it would go really well. And by this point, like 2016, 2017, it was pretty clear that that's not how it worked anymore. You needed marketing. We wanted to add voice acting to the game. Everyone who had played it said this would be amazing if you could add voice to it. I don't want to read as much. I want to listen to things. And we perhaps wanted like more platforms, things like that. At South by Southwest, I met Good Shepherd, and they wanted to give us lots of support, actually. We sent over a budget, and they said, how about more than that, which was interesting. They wanted to do localization. They wanted to sell it all over the world. They wanted to help us with voice acting. They had a lot of ideas about that. And they were really on board in general with the whole vision of the game. Also, at that same show, I had this really cool idea. I thought about the stories that you were telling, and I was like, you know what? It would be cool if we lived up to our promise of the whole folklore thing. What if stories level up when you tell them? You tell a story, and eventually you hear it come back to you in the game, and it's bigger and better and more interesting. And that also represents a more powerful story when you tell it. So that's kind of, again, multiple problems with one solution that obviously grew out of them. Both that living folklore theme that we were trying to hit, and also at this point, when the player tells stories, there's no reason to choose one story over another, right? But when you add in this level up mechanic, then it becomes which one do I want to kind of boost? Also, you know, I can tell a better story and kind of move my progress with this character a little bit more, but that will leave some of my other stories unleveled. So now stories level up the more you tell them. They grow and change into better stories that's more effective in the game. That's really cool. The stories that you get from characters that are based on like lived experience, we don't really want to change those, right? Those aren't supposed to be folklore. Those are supposed to be the true stories. So we can't change those in the same way. But instead, those became wildcard stories. When a character asks for like a scary story or a happy story or whatever, you normally have to choose the right kind. But if you tell them a story about another character, someone's life experience has so many varied parts in it that it will always, you can tell it in any way you want, and it'll come across as whatever they want. They're super powerful, but those don't level up. So again, it's a choice. Like, do you tell the story that will absolutely fulfill this character's needs, or do you tell one that then gets to kind of grow into something better, evolve the more you battle it, Pokemon style? And then each chapter of a character's story provides a new level story, and that's pretty awesome. And then at this point, we started doing voice stuff, which was really cool. Good Shepherd had an agency that they liked, but I had other people that I wanted to cast, and I wanted it to be a SAG-AFTRA game, like a union game, because many of the characters in the game are union. Like I said, this became a game about labor rights, and also personally, I am, and many of the other people who worked on this game are, so we knew we wanted to do a union game. And we got some really great, talented folks that way. I'm going to play a quick trailer here. I think I'm running low on time, but we're going to do this anyway.
Yes, this country is built from stories, pieces passed along and grown into the foundation of this land.
The law? I can get by with the law.
I've seen terrible things too. Biblical floods and starving folks.
Look in a man's eye when they're aiming to kill you. It's as sharp as a gunshot.
You ever wake up already silently screaming in your head? Have you ever begged for 10 cents?
We've got a right to live. And if the bank people and the rich men won't let us, whose fault is it if we snap?
After all, this land was made by you and me, telling each other who we are, over and over again.
All right, yeah. Thank you, yeah. So the game has Sting in it. That's weird. When we started doing this voice stuff, we luckily did not have to do many rewrites of the content to accommodate that, because again, the game hadn't been planned with voice from the beginning, right? But mostly we just had to stop doing our dynamic text in ink, things like that. However, it took a lot of time to record all this. I calculated this recently, it was 36 hours in the booth for the characters, another 36 for the narrator, and that's a lot of time. It's a very big game, it turns out. And then on to shipping. Because, again, it's a very big game, the QA process was really long and painful. It just had a lot of content for the testers to go through. It's a huge game to cover. We also, again, we're doing localization. Good Shepherd really was into that. The problem with a game with like 200,000 words in it is that's a lot to translate and a lot to test. And then there was all the rest of everything that goes into shipping. We had to pick release dates. We had to make store assets. We had to figure out how to support different store types in the API, things like that. But then the game came out, and that was that. The end. Thank you. Sure, yeah, I guess we have time for one question, if there is one out there. Yep, there's one over here. The very farthest distance possible.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Has this experience made you hungering for making more games like this?
Not like this, certainly. My next game will absolutely be short and take about 2 years to make. This, I do, however, like, kind of before Gone Home, I was a programmer and really wanted to make things that were programmer-y kind of games, things with mechanics and procedural generation and stuff like that, and I really fell hard into the whole like narrative game scene, both before and during the process of making this game, and I think that I would really like to make more story games, more narrative games with heavily authored content, things like that. Cool, well, I guess that's all we have time for, so thank you so much for coming.